On today's video, A.D. Mitchell is a player who analytical rankers despise, but the big NFL mockers seem to like a good bit. So, what's the deal with the controversy on A.D. Mitchell? How much should the analytics scare us? And what can tape and analyzing the Sarkisian offense tell us about who A.D. Mitchell actually is or might be? Sit down, relax, and stay tuned. And so last up on this list, A.D. Mitchell, the wide receiver from Texas who once played at Georgia. Now, have you ever heard the thing where there's a limited amount of people in a room and two of them have the same date of birth? Well, we have 4 players on this list, and A.D. Mitchell and Brian Thomas Jr. were born on the exact same day. So going back to the Brian Thomas Jr., that puts A.D. Mitchell's birthday right in that first to second quartile range, or the gap between being in the youngest group and the second youngest group. He is listed at 6'4", 196 pounds. He is very lean, but again, that 6'4" does have, he has good size. Going back to this, it's kind of the same conversation with Brian Thomas Jr. Is he a little bit lean, and would I feel better if he had the BMI of Keon Coleman? Probably, but he's nowhere near the Troy Franklin range, right? I was watching, these all 22s, and there just happened to be one play where Adonai Mitchell went in motion, and he crossed in front of Quinn Ewers. And now Quinn Ewers isn't the biggest quarterback. He's probably 6'2", 195. But you could tell, when Adonai Mitchell ran past him, that's a big dude. He might be lean in the middle, and he might play light a little bit, and we'll get to some of those things, later on in the bit. But he does have very good size that I don't think, even with being 6'4", I don't think people give him credit for a lot of times, because again, he does look a little leaner than some of those size numbers would kind of indicate. Now, I've already kind of spilled the beans on A.D. Mitchell being last on these 4. Now, I still feel confident about him being over everybody I listed on the last show between 8 and 15, and it's not the only reason, because again, I don't like to use hard lines for any of these things, but it is very much the easiest argument to make that A.D. Mitchell is just by far, by every number I look at, the worst analytical prospect on this list. In terms of a peak season, A.D. Mitchell's peak receiving yards percentage was 20.9% in his junior year. That is the lowest by about 6% behind Brian Thomas Jr.'s peak season of 26.7%. Now, A.D. Mitchell did have the best freshman year, but that, it was 29 receptions, 426 yards, and 4 touchdowns. So it's not like he had a Xavier Worthy freshman year where you could actually consider it a good and productive season. Now, he was hurt the sophomore year, and that's a very key detail because none of these other players have had a significant injury that kept them out for a full season. But when he did get a full season with Texas, the numbers just aren't quite there, right? Including the 20.9% receiving yards. I don't look at receptions too often because I find that, players like Troy Franklin and Brian Thomas Jr., you don't want to punish them for having lower reception numbers because they score so many 75-yard touchdowns. But it is important to note in a comparative sense that every other player has had at least a season with 22.4% of their team's receptions. A.D. Mitchell this year was 17.4%. So that's, again, significantly lower. Every other prospect has at least 2 yards per route run in a season. Keon Coleman, I mentioned how, he had bad quarterback play in the Michigan State year, or at least poor efficiency from his quarterbacks in the Michigan State year, but he still had a 2.07 year. A.D. Mitchell this year with Quinn Ewers had a 1.72. So there's a couple reasons why I'm not, completely, booting him down my rankings to wide receiver 15 or anything like that, and we'll get into that. But when we're comparing him to these near first round prospect profiles, I do think this is a significant reason, and probably the driving force, and probably should be the driving force to A.D. Mitchell being the bottom of this tier. And I can completely understand and justify arguments for him being so much lower because, again, my own philosophies say that these things are very important. And so looking at these things that are very important and seeing A.D. Mitchell score so poorly in them is very significant, right? So I think we should really get right into the film off this because contextualizing these numbers is going to be everything about A.D. Mitchell. And I think, I've tried to avoid talking about 2025 players for a bit because, that time will definitely come. If you don't know too much about my writing, say if you're new to this show and haven't followed it on Reddit, we will be talking about 2025 prospects pretty early, just not before the end of the draft season, definitely. But, Carson Beck, the Georgia quarterback, gets all this flack for being a system quarterback, and I do understand why, because Georgia has a system that they run, and they spread the ball around a lot and all these things and yada yada. But I feel like Quinn Ewers does not get the system quarterback label because of the fact that he used to be the number one overall prospect, and so I think just by being the number one overall prospect in terms of like high school recruiting, that people just refused the idea that he could be a system quarterback. But as someone who watches them both play a lot, like Carson Beck makes a lot of downfield, over the middle layered throws. Quinn Ewers does hit some intermediate throws, but he does a lot of screens, swings. It's the most paint by numbers offense in college football, right? And when you look at what a quarterback can do in it, you look at the Mac Jones year in his final year at Alabama. Like that was his second year in the Steve Sarkisian offense. And so I guess what I'm getting at all this is the reason that I say wide receiver production is important is because of earning targets. Well, in this offense, it's a lot harder to earn targets because you have so many plays where you are the decoy, right? I mean, I don't know if this is going to make sense to a lot of people, but the image that kept flashing through my head, just because it's a little funny, but if you've ever seen Ted Lasso, he tries to demonstrate how to be a decoy in one scene where he's like, hey, look at me over here, over here. And that's what A.D. Mitchell does on every play. He's just, he's kind of just pretending to do something while the play goes to the other half field read. And that happens so frequently on his tape that it's just so hard to, it's so hard to be like, well, he didn't get a target here, or well, he didn't win here. Well, he didn't even, like, his goal wasn't even to win there. Like, that is not the design of the play. And so A.D. Mitchell might end up being the shortest conversation here because it is a lot more about just projecting him. Obviously all these things are projections, but A.D. Mitchell didn't have the opportunity because of this paint by numbers offense. And I think I do blame that for a lot of this production. So it's hard to, quantify all these things on a show like this because, A.D. Mitchell's numbers are so objectively bad. But I guess we'll get into some of the traits. He's got the 6'4" size. Like I said, he is lean, and sometimes he doesn't play with the play strength that you want to see him play with, but he is a big guy, and he has the potential, I think, to be dominant at the catch point. And that's kind of the difference between, A.D. Mitchell, the top 20 pick, and A.D. Mitchell, who he is now, which is probably, maybe an early day 2 pick, like a really early day 2 pick. But A.D. Mitchell has almost no drops in like the last 2 years. He's very reliable at the catch point. He's very malleable in his movements. He kind of reminds me of, he gets a few different comparisons, but he kind of reminds me of a very unrefined and much smaller version of like a Drake London, which obviously, that's again the difference between being a high pick and a day 2 pick are those different things, because Drake London was very refined, very nuanced, and very consistent with his refinement and his nuance. But the way these guys move and shake, and they don't have to be the fastest guy on the field, but they just seem to, be able to move in ways that 6'4" guys that are that tall, that have limbs that long, don't usually move in that malleable of a way that easily. So when you look at the fact that he has this incredibly low drop percentage, and he's been used as a red zone weapon, which we'll get to in a bit, throughout his career, you see this archetype that can develop where he can be this dominant contested catch guy, but he hasn't actually had that many contested catch opportunities in his career, and there are times where he doesn't necessarily look that physically strong at the catch point. And not being that physically strong at the catch point is a concern for me because, let's just say out of these 4, he's either third or fourth. Like I could see an argument with Franklin. I couldn't see an argument with anybody else in terms of where A.D. Mitchell is at the catch point right now. And so, if he can get that strength to supplement his natural hands and the fact that he hasn't dropped the ball, that's going to be something that can turn him into a potentially dominant player and making the most out of that malleability. On the same level, he's a very good route runner to a point, or to a certain rep, right? You can find reps where he has beautiful routes where you can tell he faked the defender so badly and he got the momentum going exactly the way he needed to go, and he jerked back in another direction so smoothly that the corner just wasn't expecting it for a guy that big. But you can also find reps on his tape where it kind of feels like maybe, I don't know, he's getting caught in between two ideas, or he's a little unsure maybe even of what he's doing. And you see some bad attempts and some bad routes out there. And it's just this level up of consistency, right? Drake London was this incredibly productive player, and he was this incredibly productive player despite the circumstances around him because he was so physical and he was so consistent. AD Mitchell has a lot of the same physical upsides, but he's not that physical and he's not that consistent. And so if he can develop those things, that'll be a big deal, because already this guy is just a red zone assassin. Because, you look at it, this guy has played in 5 playoff games. He played in 4 with the University of Georgia. He played in 1 with Texas. He scored a touchdown in all 5 of them. Those are big time games, obviously. And you don't make too much about one game when you're scouting, but you're crazy if you don't think that that's being said in high level rooms. This is a guy who makes big plays at big moments. And at the end of the day, those plays, if they're coming inconsistently for our fantasy teams, he might not be the best wide receiver, but if he can make red zone plays, that's going to be that's a 53-man roster guy all day. So we have seen him play in this higher volume role a few times. You can see the Kansas tape, you can see the Kansas State tape, I believe against Oklahoma State. These are games where he had 100 yards. A lot of them he had 10 receptions. And so you can see there are times, at least a few times throughout his college career, specifically in this last year, where they kind of said, okay, we believe that you can break somebody today, and we're just going to let you break the defense today. And that's a very encouraging thing to see. But on the flip side, about 8 or 9 of those games, he only got about 3 receptions. So he was almost completely phased out of the game, especially in terms of a volume target perspective, right? He might have gotten an important target or a red zone target, but he was only getting 3 receptions a game for a good number of those games. And so that's, this big issue where there is value in what AD Mitchell is doing. And it's easy to see the value, but in terms of what we're actually looking for and what has proven to be success from a metric perspective over time, in terms of generating targets, in terms of generating a percentage of your yards, AD Mitchell scores very poorly in those areas. So as much as you can see these dominant games, and you could even project and say, well, if he returned for the senior year with Worthy and Jatavion Sanders going to the draft, he would have put up incredible numbers this year. And, maybe that's true. But at the end of the day, we haven't seen it. And then just one last film note on approach. I did notice or have seen some people talk about maybe approach things with AD Mitchell on field. And in my opinion, there's just a lot of reps in terms of, maybe taking reps off, I guess is what I'm getting at. And I guess, in my opinion, it's more coming down to that same paint by numbers Sarkisian system thing, where it's not necessarily that he's taking a play off. It's just that, it's a sprint out to the right and he's on the left side, and there's just nothing for him to do on the play. Even selling the fake is only relevant if the boundary corner is willing to run 65 yards in a diagonal, maybe even more than 65 yards across the field, for the outside chance that the play breaks out and he can also make that distance in time. You know what I mean? On top of that, there are a lot of positive vibes around AD Mitchell off field. I mentioned this in my very first show. He has an article on the Players Tribune. He is very well beloved by Georgia, which is significant to me because you're not always loved by the school you leave in transfers or the fan base you leave when you transfer. You're often disliked. There's sometimes you get a little bit of, media mud. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. Maybe it's just people airing out the things they disliked about you the most while you were there. AD Mitchell had all positive vibes when he left Georgia and went to Texas, and he had all positive vibes at Texas. So this is a guy that, seems to be someone who coaches like a lot. So, he did play in 2 systems that don't really require him to do much on a lot of plays. And so I think that's more so where it comes from. Maybe that's just my eye. But AD Mitchell is a player, on just one final note towards him, that is probably the hardest evaluation. I talked about Brian Thomas Jr. is probably the easiest evaluation to me, right? Maybe not the easiest to rank, but the easiest evaluation. Big, tall, fast. Doesn't necessarily do nuanced things as well as you want him to do. Where do you rank a guy like that with first-round draft capital? AD Mitchell's the hardest because it's When it comes to traits, he has a lot of traits that I really like, that I really covet. With just his size, ability to move, and ability to catch the ball alone, even though he's not necessarily consistent yet, or doesn't necessarily have the play strength yet that I want to see with a player that has that 6'4" frame, those things alone are things that often are intriguing to me because they can turn into high volume roles, right? I mean, this is a guy who some of his high upside comps might look like a Drake London or DeAndre Hopkins, a guy who comes back to the ball a lot and makes all those catches and just gets a really high volume target role. But at the same time, that kind of guy you would want to see be insanely productive at the college level. And while he does have excuses between the injury in the sophomore year and the paint by numbers offense in the junior year, at the end of the day, excuses aren't a reason for us to make somebody be a positive, right? I think too often in fantasy, maybe in life, I don't know, but too often in fantasy, we find an excuse for something and we say, okay, well, now that we found an excuse, we can just imply the positive. An excuse does not allow you to just apply the positive. The positive, we can't just assume that the positive would have happened if the excuse didn't happen. We don't know what would have happened. Maybe we would have, exposed some of these players more and we would have been more confident that they weren't great before the draft. That's certainly possible as well. So I think A.D. Mitchell has an excused absence, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he has good production, and it still makes his production worse than everybody on this list, even though Brian Thomas Jr.'s peak season isn't all that impressive to me. So with him being last in production, with him feeling the most like a project, and with me not being able to fully sell myself on the traits, even though he has all these things that I look for, the play strength in particular is just not quite there for me to make him as projectable as, say, an 85-90% of Drake London. I don't think he's quite there, because if the play strength is a problem at the next level, then the drops, the hands aren't going to matter, because unless he becomes that elite route runner. So, again, he has the two paths. I think that's the big thing with A.D. Mitchell, is that he has the two paths, but he is the biggest project. And so for that reason, right now, I have him at wide receiver 7 and at the bottom of this list. This video is part of a longer podcast with the link in the description. I really have no idea what I'm doing yet exactly. I'm getting better piece by piece with the production side of things, so the podcast has not yet been available on major platforms yet from searching, but that should be fixed by next week. I do have a new episode this week as well, not in the description, talking about the stock rise of J.J. McCarthy, so look out for a video segment on this later this week. Finally, share the content with a friend if you can. It means a lot to me, and it's one of the most important things you could do for the potential growth of this show. Please take care. Goodbye.